In this episode, we take a planning step that sounds simple but actually determines whether an audit changes anything in the real world: writing audit objectives that connect directly to business risk. New learners sometimes treat objectives as a formal requirement you write once and then ignore, but strong objectives are the backbone of a useful audit because they tell everyone what questions the audit is trying to answer and why those questions matter. Artificial intelligence, AI, systems can create risk in unusual ways, such as exposing sensitive data through outputs, making decisions that affect customers unfairly, or being manipulated through prompts without any traditional breach indicators. If you write objectives that focus only on technology details, the audit may produce findings that sound technical but do not clearly matter to leadership. If you write objectives that tie controls to real business outcomes, your findings become easier to prioritize, easier to remediate, and harder to dismiss. The goal here is to build objectives that feel like they belong to the business, while still being precise enough to test with evidence. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To connect objectives to business risk, you first need a plain language understanding of what business risk means in an AI context. Business risk is the possibility that the organization will lose something it values or fail to meet an obligation, such as customer trust, revenue, safety, privacy commitments, operational stability, or legal requirements. AI changes how that risk shows up because it can influence decisions and communications at scale, often faster than humans can review. For example, a model that drafts customer messages can amplify a mistake into thousands of communications, and a model that supports internal decisions can create a pattern of wrong choices that is hard to spot until consequences accumulate. When you set audit objectives, you are deciding which of these outcomes you will protect and how you will judge whether protection is adequate. Beginners often start with vague goals like assess security, but you should train yourself to say assess security in order to reduce specific harms. The more clearly you describe the harm, the more useful the objective becomes. A practical way to begin writing objectives is to start from the business process the AI system supports, not from the model itself. A model is a component, but the business cares about the process outcomes, such as accurate support responses, safe recommendations, compliant handling of personal data, or reliable internal decision support. So you ask what could go wrong in that process if the AI component fails, is misused, or is manipulated. That could include confidentiality breaches, harmful content reaching customers, biased outcomes that create regulatory and reputational damage, or outages that disrupt operations and increase cost. When the objective names the business process and the potential harm, it stops being abstract and starts being something stakeholders can relate to. It also helps you choose evidence later, because evidence should show whether the controls reduce the chance of that harm. This process-first mindset prevents the audit from becoming a narrow inspection of technology settings divorced from the reasons the system exists. Now add a second layer of thinking that is especially important for AI: how the system scales impact. Traditional IT systems can fail at scale too, but AI systems can generate outputs, decisions, and actions rapidly, which means small control weaknesses can produce large outcomes quickly. That scaling effect belongs in your objectives because it changes what adequate control means. If a system is used occasionally by a few trained users, certain controls might be acceptable that would be risky in a public-facing system used by thousands of people. If a system is connected to sensitive internal data sources, the confidentiality risk becomes much higher than if it only references public information. If the system can trigger actions through integrations, the risk shifts from wrong words to wrong actions, which is a different business impact category. Audit objectives should reflect those differences in exposure and potential blast radius. Beginners sometimes think objectives should be generic so they fit everything, but generic objectives lead to generic results. Good objectives are tailored to the system's scale, connectivity, and decision influence. With that foundation, you can start building objectives that connect controls to outcomes by using a cause and effect framing in your own mind. The business outcome might be protecting customer data, maintaining reliable service, or ensuring trustworthy decisions. And the controls might be access restrictions, monitoring, change management, or incident response capability. Your objective is not to list the controls. It is to evaluate whether the controls are effective enough to reduce the business risk. This is where you avoid a common audit trap, writing objectives that describe activities instead of results. For example, an objective that says review access controls is an activity, but an objective that says evaluate whether access controls prevent unauthorized access to sensitive AI data and model management capabilities is closer to a risk statement. The objective should still be testable, meaning you can gather evidence and decide whether it is met. If the objective cannot be tested, it becomes an argument rather than an audit conclusion. Another key step is distinguishing between risk appetite and risk acceptance, because those concepts shape what it means for controls to be sufficient. Risk appetite is the level of risk the business is willing to tolerate in pursuit of its goals, and it can vary by process and by regulatory environment. A customer-facing medical assistant would have a very low tolerance for harmful advice, while an internal brainstorming tool might tolerate a higher level of imperfect output as long as sensitive data is protected. Risk acceptance is the decision to live with a known risk that cannot be fully eliminated or is not worth eliminating, and that decision should be explicit and documented. Audit objectives that connect to business risk should align with the organization's appetite, meaning you evaluate controls against what the business claims it requires. If the business says it cannot tolerate disclosure of personal data, then the objective must directly evaluate whether the system prevents that disclosure, not merely whether policies exist. This alignment prevents the audit from becoming a theoretical exercise disconnected from real expectations. Stakeholder language matters when writing objectives, because if your objectives sound like security jargon, business leaders may misunderstand what the audit is trying to achieve. You do not need to remove technical meaning, but you should translate technical risk into business-relevant terms. For instance, prompt injection can be described as a method attackers use to steer the model into revealing restricted information or taking unsafe actions, which connects to confidentiality, integrity, and operational risk. Model drift can be described as a gradual change in behavior that can reduce reliability and increase error rates, which connects to service quality and decision risk. Data poisoning can be described as corruption of learning material that changes future behavior, which connects to trust and long-term performance risk. When objectives are written in language that both technical and non-technical stakeholders understand, they are more likely to be supported, and the evidence you gather will be easier to interpret in the final report. Objectives are also a communication tool, not only a planning tool. You should also decide whether objectives will focus on prevention, detection, response, or some balance, because business risk is not reduced by prevention alone. In AI systems, some misuse will happen, some failures will occur, and some changes will have unintended effects, so resilience becomes part of risk management. That means your objectives should often include questions about detection and containment, such as whether monitoring can spot abuse early and whether incident response can reduce harm quickly. Businesses care about downtime, customer impact, and reputational damage, and those are often shaped by how fast the organization detects and responds. An objective that only evaluates whether controls exist at design time may miss whether the organization can manage real-world events at runtime. Beginners sometimes assume audits are static snapshots, but objectives that connect to business risk should reflect the system lifecycle, including updates, new data connectors, and evolving usage. If the AI system is expected to change often, objective language should account for change control and ongoing assurance, not just initial configuration. Another powerful way to connect objectives to business risk is to tie them to decision points, because decisions are where models often create the most consequential outcomes. If an AI system influences hiring screens, credit decisions, customer support escalations, fraud flags, or internal risk assessments, the business risk includes fairness, customer harm, and regulatory exposure. An audit objective here might focus on whether controls ensure that decisions are explainable enough for accountability, that inputs are controlled, and that human oversight exists where required. You are not trying to audit every possible output, but you are trying to evaluate whether the decision pathway has guardrails that prevent predictable harm. Even for beginners, it helps to see that decision risk is not only about accuracy, it is also about governance and accountability. If a harmful decision occurs, the business will be asked who approved the system, who monitored it, and what evidence shows it was controlled. Objectives should be written so the audit can answer those questions. Data risk deserves special attention in AI audit objectives because data is both an asset and a behavior-shaping input. When AI systems are connected to internal documents, customer records, or proprietary knowledge, business risk includes confidentiality, privacy compliance, and loss of competitive advantage. Objectives should directly evaluate whether data is minimized, whether access is restricted appropriately, whether retention aligns with policy, and whether data flows are understood and controlled. Data also drives integrity risk, because if training or retrieval data is corrupted or untrustworthy, the model's outputs can become unreliable in ways that damage business decisions. So objectives that connect to business risk often include questions about data provenance, validation, and controls around updates. Beginners sometimes think data security is only about encryption, but in AI systems it is also about where data is sourced, how it is selected, and how it is kept from being manipulated. Good objectives keep these ideas together because the business consequences can be similar even when the technical failure mode differs. Vendor dependence is another place where objectives must connect to business risk, because vendor services can become critical infrastructure even if the organization does not view them that way at first. If a vendor hosts the model, controls around data handling, access, monitoring, change notification, and incident coordination directly affect the business's ability to protect customers and maintain service. If a vendor provides training data or model artifacts, the business risk includes supply chain integrity, licensing issues, and embedded vulnerabilities that the organization may not be able to see. Objectives should clarify whether the audit is evaluating the vendor directly, the organization's vendor management process, or both, and they should connect those evaluations to outcomes like confidentiality, reliability, and compliance. This keeps the audit from drifting into an argument about whether the vendor is trustworthy in general. Instead, you evaluate whether the organization has enough evidence and contractual control to manage risk where visibility ends. Business leaders understand vendor risk when it is framed as dependence and accountability, and objectives should make that connection explicit. Timing and system change also belong in objectives because AI systems evolve and risk often appears during change. A model update can alter behavior, a prompt template change can remove a safeguard, a new connector can expose sensitive data, and a new integration can increase operational impact. An objective that connects to business risk should consider whether changes are reviewed, tested, and monitored in a way that prevents surprises. This is especially important when the business is making promises to customers about how data will be used and protected, because unreviewed changes can quietly violate those promises. For beginners, it helps to understand that many incidents are not caused by sophisticated attackers, but by rushed changes, unclear ownership, and missing validation. So an objective might focus on whether the organization's change management process for AI protects the business from unintended shifts in risk. When objectives include lifecycle assurance, the audit can evaluate not only what is true today, but whether the organization can keep it true tomorrow. When you write objectives, you also need to keep them small enough to be achievable and specific enough to be proven. An objective that tries to certify the entire AI program as safe is too broad, and it invites debates about what safe means. A better approach is to craft objectives around a few high-risk themes that matter most to the business, such as protecting sensitive data, preventing unauthorized access to model management capabilities, ensuring monitoring and response readiness, and controlling changes that can alter behavior. Each objective should imply what evidence would satisfy it, like access reviews, configuration histories, monitoring telemetry, incident response records, and governance approvals. This is how objectives become testable rather than aspirational. It is also how you avoid a plan that collapses under its own weight, because you can allocate time and resources to gather the evidence required. Beginners sometimes want to include everything because they fear missing something. But strong auditing is about prioritization, and objectives are the mechanism that forces prioritization to be explicit and defensible. As we wrap up, Remember that audit objectives are the bridge between AI controls and business outcomes, and that bridge is what makes an audit matter. Objectives that connect directly to business risk name the business process, the potential harm, the exposure and scale factors, and the control effectiveness questions that must be answered with evidence. They use language that stakeholders understand, yet remain precise enough that the auditor can test them and reach defensible conclusions. They consider the full life cycle of the system, including changes, vendor dependencies, monitoring, and incident response readiness, because business risk is shaped by how the system behaves over time, not just by its initial design. When you can write objectives this way, you are not merely planning an audit. You are defining how the organization will prove that its AI systems are trustworthy enough for the business to rely on. That is the heart of Domain 3A, and it sets you up for every later audit step, from selecting criteria to gathering evidence to communicating findings that drive real improvement.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.